As a follow-up to the engagement between business and government, I'd like to ask a question of Mr. Deep Kapuria, a co-chair of the B20 Digital Economy and Industry Task Force. Mr. Kapuria, what recommendations to the G20 countries from the business community do you think are the key ones in order to stimulate economic development?
First and foremost, it's a real privilege for me to be here, representing my task force as a co-chair. And some of the things, I think, the topic itself is so relevant because the way the economy is literally defining and transforming itself is really important and a very exciting era that we are in, and specifically the businesses. The way we buy things, the way we travel, the way we get our information, we are literally in a hyper digital age, if I may say so. And this technological innovations are leading to smart and very disruptive digital solutions and are really touching the lives of each and every one of us. Besides, of course, the private lives, the businesses are getting disrupted. And today, the differentiators would be how much of digitalization is primarily there in the businesses. And that would be true for countries as well. The promise to enhance the productivity and actually improve the economies is going to also give an opportunity for a very, very inclusive society. So even though the globalization comes under major attack, specifically by the countries who were the proponents of globalization, the data movement across the borders is exponentially growing. And that's what we need to really see, that it keeps doing that. So the promise of this engine of growth that we are talking about in the economies has a major potential to build an inclusive society, and that's what we are focusing on in B20, keeping in central the people and the workers in play. I think the critical role, although we know it, it's a huge, huge canvas in terms of what we are trying to address in the B20 Digital and Industry 4.0 Task Force. It's a very large canvas. It's still being populated with hues and colors, and a lot of the canvas itself is getting discovered in many ways, as we have just listened to the speakers. So I'll just address a few flavor of things because it's still under some kind of work in progress. In the task force, we have about 200 members who are across continents and very, very diverse experiences in terms of this. So first and foremost is how do we keep the workforce engaged, and how do we see that we don't create a huge population of unemployable people. And that is something we are literally focusing on. So the traditional jobs as we see them today are more likely to be displaced. And when you're talking about displacement, we need to look at how we skill, and not only skill, but reskill and get the workforce to be employable continually. There's a possibility, and thus we recommend to the governments to integrate the education system in the school curricula itself, starting with very elementary and basic education, and detail a framework of design to have an ecosystem for skilling, reskilling. It could be in apprenticeship, it could be a possibility for private and public partnerships. I think the other aspect is we critically, and I had the privilege even to attend the last evening session where a lot of the people on the podium were there, and they were talking about this, is the digital divide. So we need to get the infrastructure in place. And that too is something I think all the countries realize, but that's to get the people online, to get actively engaged, is something which the G20 leadership can do and facilitate private investment to maximize and see that there is an aspect and opportunity that the last citizen too gets engaged in this upcoming digital transformational phase. And promoting standards is going to be some of the issues, as critically the devices have some protocols, how they talk to each other, and that's something, the challenge would be a possible something which would be needed to be addressed. I think the world is greatly being impacted by data. Today we have billions and close to about 10 billion devices connected to each other, huge amount of data which is crossing borders, and literally, although there are geopolitical borders, but data doesn't really seem to have recognized them as of today. There are obviously complexities of data security, data localization, and policy, regulatory, and governing technologies is going to be something which is going to be a challenge in the future. And that is where I think a bit of caution is from the businesses side, that somewhere there's a high level of regulation, and thus it's a highly fragmented area. So either you have high regulation or you have none at all. I think that's where we need to have a fair balance so we don't literally throttle this opportunity rather than actually leverage on it. So the international data flow, which is also some of the issues which are being talked about at the multilateral forums, is a general principle should be that how we can create mechanisms so everyone and each country can leverage this cross-border protocols, and there is an opportunity of way the businesses can address it, including the issues of tax measures and issues which I just spoke about. The next aspect and the tool which is major in terms of inclusion itself of the last citizen is fintech. I think that holds huge promise to engage even the most rural person or probably the less fortunate within the society, and how to engage them in the economic gains. The blockchains which were actually created to address it now can create trust in the system, and the institutions, governments and public institutions can actually have an effective platform to essentially engage each and every one and create trust in the ecosystem. I think India has done some phenomenal work out there with literally 750 million people who are connected across the whole country. So the recommendation is in terms of valid digital identity, encouraging companies to provide an environment which can cooperate and have neutral solutions rather than specific ones. We are also now seeing the integration of the physical in the virtual world, where the way the sensors have now come to be at a level where literally each and everything going forth will have sensors and will be talking to each other. That creates...
Господин Капурия, я прошу вас придерживаться.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kapuria, could you please stick to the time limit?
So the last and final issue of how we address the SMEs and the women entrepreneur and bring them into the larger net of society through this aspect of digitization and Industry 4.0. I do hope that we in the task force can provide something which not only which I hear the ecosystem is in terms of G20, but the B20 is a force which can be cohesive going forth. And I do hope that we can do that. Thank you.